The terminal was alive with chaos, the cacophony of rolling luggage, flight announcements, and chatter blending into a familiar hum. I had traveled so much in the past 15 years that airports felt like second homes. Yet today, there was an edge to the air, something intangible that unsettled me. Maybe it was exhaustion or the weight of the deal I'd flown in to close, but I felt off. Stepping off the plane, I adjusted the strap of my bag and smoothed the front of my tailored jacket. Presentation was everything in my world. I thrived in sharp lines and structured spaces, places where I controlled the outcomes. But today, as I moved toward baggage claim, a flicker of uncertainty tugged at me. It was a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge in years. I reached the carousel and stood among a sea of strangers, each absorbed in their own bubble of impatience and weariness. I scanned the area absently, my thoughts drifting to the meeting I had in a few hours. Then my eyes landed on him. He was unmistakable, even from a distance. Michael. My ex-husband. My chest tightened, and I froze. Time had softened his edges, his once boyish face now framed by salt and pepper hair. But it was him. There was no mistaking it. For a moment, the world seemed to blur around him, the noise of the terminal dimming into a distant hum. But it wasn't just Michael. He was with a woman, a strikingly beautiful woman with deep brown skin and a graceful presence. She stood close to him, laughing at something he'd said. Beside them were two children, a boy and a girl, their features a perfect blend of Michael and her. They were beautiful, vibrant, and clearly adored. I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. My stomach churned with a mix of emotions I couldn't immediately name: shock, jealousy, regret. My instinct was to turn away, to flee before he saw me. But my feet remained rooted to the spot. Michael turned then, his eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, I thought I was safe, just another face in the sea of travelers. But then his gaze locked onto mine, and his expression shifted from relaxed to stunned. He whispered something to the woman, who glanced at me curiously, but said nothing. Before I could think better of it, I found myself walking toward him, my pulse pounding in my ears. Each step felt heavier than the last, my mind racing with questions and doubts. What would I say? How would he react? Why was I doing this? Mindy, he said, his voice tentative but familiar. Hearing my name in his voice after all these years sent a jolt through me. It was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what I had walked away from. Michael, I replied, forcing a smile. It's been a long time. 15 years, he said, his tone neutral, but tinged with something I couldn't place. You look, well. Thank you. So do you. The woman beside him watched us with quiet curiosity, her expression kind but reserved. Michael noticed and gestured toward her. This is Naomi, he said. My wife. The word wife hit me like a physical blow. I knew I had no right to feel the way I did, after all, I had been the one to leave. But the pang of jealousy and regret was undeniable. I extended a hand toward her, masking my emotions behind a polite smile. It's nice to meet you, I said. She shook my hand, her grip firm and steady. You too, she said. Michael's told me a lot about you. Her words caught me off guard. What had he told her? And why? Before I could dwell on it, the children approached, their laughter filling the space between us. Michael introduced them, Elijah, the boy, and Sophia, the girl. They were polite but shy, their wide eyes flicking between me and their parents. They're wonderful, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Michael's smile was genuine. They are. The moment felt impossibly heavy, the weight of our shared past colliding with the life he had built without me. I didn't know what to say, how to reconcile the image of Michael as a husband and father with the man I had left behind all those years ago. Naomi broke the silence, her tone gentle. We were just heading to baggage claim. It was nice meeting you, Mindy. You too, I said, stepping aside to let them pass. But as they walked away, I couldn't help but watch them, my heart aching with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Regret? Envy? Loss? Perhaps all three. I stood there long after they had disappeared into the crowd, my thoughts a whirlwind of memories and questions. Seeing Michael again had stirred something in me, something I thought I had buried long ago. But it wasn't just about him, it was about the life I had left behind, the choices I had made, and the consequences that had followed. As I finally collected my bag and headed toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was more than just coincidence. It was an opportunity, though for what, I wasn't yet sure. Sitting in the back of the cab on the way to my hotel, I couldn't focus on the skyline rushing past or the rhythmic drone of the driver's voice on a call. My mind was elsewhere, back in the airport, replaying the moment I had seen Michael and his family. Every detail stuck with me, Naomi's quiet elegance, the children's innocent smiles, and the way Michael had said "my wife" with such ease, as if I had never been part of that story. When I reached my hotel room, I set my suitcase by the door and collapsed into the armchair by the window. The weight of the day pressed down on me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly untethered. I had built my life on certainty, on control. I was a woman who made decisions and didn't look back, or so I had convinced myself. But seeing Michael had shaken that foundation. I poured myself a glass of wine from the minibar and stared out at the city below. 15 years ago, I had walked out of our house, my head held high, convinced I was making the right decision. We were both miserable, I told myself. Our marriage had become a constant battle, two strong-willed people locked in a cycle of blame and resentment. I thought I was doing us both a favor by leaving. But now, sitting in this sterile room with no one to talk to, I wondered if I had been wrong. Michael had always been the steady one, the grounding force to my ambition. He was kind, patient, and content with a simple life. I, on the other hand, had always been chasing something, success, validation, a sense of purpose that seemed just out of reach. When our differences became too much, I chose to leave. I told myself it was for the best, that we would both find happiness elsewhere. And I did, at least professionally. I had built an empire, a life of wealth and influence. But the personal costs were harder to ignore. My relationships were fleeting, my friendships transactional. I had no family waiting for me at the end of a long day, no one to share my victories or comfort me in my losses. Seeing Michael again, happy and surrounded by love, brought that reality into sharp focus. He had found what I couldn't give him, what I had convinced myself I didn't need. And Naomi wasn't just a replacement. She was someone who had stepped into his life and given him a family, a future. The thought stung more than I cared to admit. I spent the next day in a haze, going through the motions of my meetings, but unable to fully focus. Every free moment was consumed by memories of Michael, of the life we had shared and the one I had walked away from. I thought about our first apartment, the way he used to leave notes for me on the fridge. I thought about our fights, the ones that seemed so insurmountable at the time, but now felt trivial in the grand scheme of things. Why couldn't I let go of the past? And why did seeing him with Naomi make me feel so hollow? That evening, I couldn't resist the urge to look him up. His name was still saved in my phone, though I hadn't dialed it in years. I typed it into a search engine instead, half expecting to find nothing. But there he was, Michael Taylor, listed as a local business owner and community advocate. There were photos, too. One showed him at a charity event, smiling, beside Naomi and their children. Another showed him holding a plaque, his arm draped protectively around his son. The warmth in his eyes was unmistakable. It was the same look he used to give me, back when we were happy. I closed the browser and leaned back in my chair, my thoughts spinning. I didn't regret my success, I had worked too hard to reach where I was. But for the first time, I wondered if I had sacrificed too much to get here. My world was polished and perfect on the outside, but inside, it was empty. Seeing Michael with his family had forced me to confront that emptiness in a way I never had before. 2 days later, as I prepared to leave the city, I found myself at the airport again. This time, I wasn't expecting to see him, but part of me hoped I might. I wanted to talk to him, to say something, anything, that could bridge the years between us. I didn't know what I was looking for. Closure, perhaps. Or maybe just a chance to apologize. As I waited in line for security, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Mindy? I turned, my heart skipping a beat. It was Michael, holding a cup of coffee and looking just as surprised as I felt. Michael, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. What are the odds? He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Pretty slim, I'd say. Are you leaving today? I nodded. Yes. Back to New York. And you? Just dropping Naomi and the kids off. They're flying to visit her family for a few weeks. His words left a strange feeling in my chest, relief, maybe, or guilt. That sounds nice, I said, unsure of what else to offer. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, the noise of the terminal swirling around us. Finally, Michael broke the silence. It was unexpected, seeing you the other day, he said. I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk. I wasn't sure either, I admitted. But I'm glad we did. He studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said softly, I don't blame you for leaving. I was angry for a long time, but I get it now. We weren't right for each other then. His words caught me off guard. I don't know if that's true, I said. I think we just didn't know how to be right for each other. He nodded, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Maybe. Before I could say more, the line moved, and we had to part ways. But as I walked through security, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the conversation. There was more to say, more to understand. The flight back to New York was a blur of muffled announcements and restless thoughts. I replayed the brief exchange with Michael over and over, dissecting every word, every glance. He had looked at me with such a mix of familiarity and distance, as if I were both a stranger and someone he had once known intimately. I couldn't decide which version of me he saw, or which version of him I had seen. Back at home, I threw myself into work. It was the easiest way to quiet my mind, to avoid the questions I wasn't ready to face. My team was used to my intensity, and they didn't bat an eye when I arrived early and left late, my phone buzzing with calls and emails. But even the endless demands of my job couldn't erase the lingering ache in my chest. Why did seeing Michael again feel like such a turning point? And why couldn't I stop thinking about him? A week later, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then picked it up. Mindy? It's Michael. Hearing his voice made my heart skip. Michael, I said, trying to sound composed. This is unexpected. I hope it's not unwelcome, he said, his tone warm but cautious. Not at all, I said quickly. What's on your mind? There was a pause on the other end, the faint sound of background noise filtering through. I was wondering if we could talk, he said. There are things I've wanted to say for a long time, and seeing you again, it brought all of that back. My breath caught. I'd like that, I said, surprising even myself with the steadiness in my voice. We arranged to meet that weekend at a quiet cafe halfway between his home and my office. The anticipation in the days leading up to it was almost unbearable. I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish, but the thought of hearing his perspective, of finally addressing the wounds we had both carried, filled me with equal parts dread and relief. When I arrived, Michael was already there, seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away. I saw the man I had married, the man I had shared so many dreams and disappointments with. And yet, he wasn't the same. There was a calmness in him now, a sense of rootedness that hadn't been there before. Mindy, he said, standing to greet me. Thanks for coming. Of course, I said, sitting across from him. I'm glad you called. The conversation began cautiously, with polite questions about work and family. But it wasn't long before we delved into the deeper topics, the ones we had both avoided for years. I was angry for a long time, Michael admitted, staring into his coffee. When you left, I didn't understand it. It felt like you gave up on us. I did, I said quietly. I was so focused on what I thought I needed that I couldn't see what I already had. I thought leaving would fix everything, for both of us. Did it? He asked, his voice soft. I hesitated. In some ways, yes. I found success, stability. But in other ways, no. I lost something I didn't realize I needed until it was too late. He looked at me then, his expression filled with a mix of understanding and sadness. You weren't wrong about us struggling, he said. But I've always wondered if we could have found a way through it. If we'd just tried harder. I wonder that too, I admitted. But it's not a question we can answer now. No, he said. But it's still worth talking about. For the next hour, we revisited the life we had shared, the good, the bad, and the parts that still lingered in the spaces between us. I told him about the guilt I had carried, the nights I had spent questioning my choices. He told me about the pain of rebuilding, of finding a new sense of purpose in the midst of heartbreak. When he spoke of Naomi, his voice softened. She saved me, in a way, he said. She taught me how to love again, how to let go of the past. I owe her so much. Hearing him speak of her wasn't easy, but it wasn't as painful as I had expected. Naomi wasn't just his wife, she was part of the reason he had become the man sitting across from me now, a man I respected and cared for, even after all this time. As the conversation wound down, Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I didn't call you to rehash the past, he said. I called because I wanted to understand. And because I wanted you to know that I don't blame you anymore. Tears welled in my eyes, and I blinked them away quickly. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling around us. Finally, I asked the question that had been on my mind since the airport. Do you think we'll ever be able to? I don't know, be friends? He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. I think we can try, he said. For what it's worth, I'm glad we ran into each other. It feels like a door I thought was closed has opened, even if it's not in the way I expected. Me too, I said, my heart lighter than it had been in years. As we left the cafe, he walked me to my car. There was no lingering tension, no unresolved anger, just a quiet understanding between two people who had once shared everything and were now finding a new way forward. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of closure and possibility. This wasn't the end of our story, it was something new, something uncharted. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it. The weeks following my conversation with Michael were a delicate dance of hope and hesitation. We had opened a door I wasn't sure either of us had anticipated, and the question now was whether I had the courage to step through. He reached out occasionally, texts, a phone call here and there, but always with a clear boundary. His life with Naomi and their children was his present, and I couldn't forget that. But then, one afternoon, an unexpected message arrived. Michael, Naomi and the kids are hosting a small barbecue this weekend. They suggested inviting you. No pressure, but it might be nice for everyone to meet properly. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The idea of stepping into their world felt both thrilling and terrifying. Would I be welcome? Could I handle seeing Michael with Naomi, their life so clearly separate from the one I had left behind? But then I thought of James and Emily, the laughter I had heard at the airport. Perhaps this was a chance to begin something new, not as a replacement, but as a presence. I typed out a response before I could second-guess myself. Me, I'd like that. Thank you. When Saturday arrived, I found myself standing at the edge of Michael and Naomi's backyard, a bottle of wine clutched nervously in my hands. The scene was idyllic, a modest grill sending plumes of smoke into the air, a folding table laden with food, and the kids chasing each other with water balloons. Naomi stood by the grill, laughing as Michael flipped burgers, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For a moment, I felt like an intruder. This was their life, their family. What place did I have here? Mindy. Michael called, waving me over. His warmth eased some of my tension, and I forced a smile as I approached. Naomi turned and greeted me with that same gracious smile I had seen at the airport. "We're so glad you could come," she said, taking the wine from my hands. "You didn't have to bring anything." "It's the least I could do," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease. Naomi introduced me to their neighbors, and Michael made sure I always had a plate of food or a drink in hand. The children, initially shy, warmed up to me after I joined their water balloon fight, laughing harder than I had in years. It was strange, seeing Michael in this setting, so at home, so at ease. He wasn't the man I had left, he was someone new, someone who had grown into a life that suited him. As the sun began to set, Naomi sat beside me on the porch, a glass of lemonade in her hand. The kids were sprawled on the lawn, exhausted but happy, and Michael was chatting with one of the neighbors near the grill. "You've made quite an impression on them," she said, nodding toward the children. "Elijah hasn't stopped talking about how good you are at dodging water balloons." I laughed, grateful for her kindness. "They're wonderful kids. You've done a great job." "Thank you," she said, her tone softening. "It hasn't always been easy, but they're my world." Her words hit me with a pang of guilt and admiration. I had walked away from Michael, but she had built something beautiful with him. "You've made him very happy," I said, my voice wavering slightly. She looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "Michael's talked about you," she said. "Not in a bad way, but I know you were a big part of his life. I don't think that ever really goes away." Her honesty disarmed me. "I've carried a lot of regret," I admitted. "But seeing him like this, it's clear I made the right choice for him, even if it wasn't the right one for me." Naomi nodded, her gaze steady. "I think we all have paths we're meant to take. And sometimes, those paths cross again in unexpected ways." Her words lingered with me as the evening wound down. When it was time to leave, Michael walked me to my car, his hands in his pockets. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I think it meant a lot to them. And to me." "Thank you for inviting me," I said. "You've built something wonderful, Michael. I'm glad I got to see it." He hesitated, then added, "You're welcome anytime, you know." I smiled, though my chest ached with the weight of everything unspoken. I'll keep that in mind. Over the following months, I found myself slowly becoming part of their lives. Naomi's warmth made it easier, and the children's enthusiasm was infectious. I joined them for dinners, outings, even Elijah's birthday party, where he proudly introduced me to his friends as Aunt Mindy. The title stung at first, a reminder of what I wasn't, but I accepted it gratefully. One evening, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The kids were in the living room, arguing over a board game, and Naomi had stepped outside to take a call. As we worked in comfortable silence, he glanced at me. "I didn't expect this," he said, his tone quiet. "You being here, part of our lives again. It's good." "It is," I said, meeting his gaze. "I didn't expect it either, but I'm glad for it." Before he could respond, Naomi walked back in, her face pale and strained. "It's my mother," she said, her voice trembling. "She's in the hospital. I need to go." Michael immediately stepped forward, wrapping an arm around her. "Of course. We'll figure it out." I offered to stay with the kids while they made arrangements, and Naomi gave me a grateful nod before hurrying to pack a bag. As I watched her leave, a strange feeling settled over me, a mix of concern for her and a growing sense of responsibility for the family she had created. Naomi's departure to care for her mother was supposed to be temporary, a few days, maybe a week. But as the days stretched into weeks, her updates grew more concerning. Her mother's condition was worse than expected, requiring constant care, and Naomi stayed by her side, splitting her time between the hospital and her childhood home. In her absence, the responsibility of keeping the family running fell to Michael. And, by extension, to me. At first, I only intended to help with the occasional dinner or school pickup. But as the days passed, it became clear that Michael needed more support than he could admit. His work, the children's schedules, and the emotional toll of Naomi's absence weighed heavily on him. I found myself stepping into roles I hadn't anticipated, helping Elijah with his math homework, cheering Sophia on at her soccer game, and cooking meals that brought a sense of normalcy to their evenings. It felt strange at first, stepping into this life that wasn't mine. But it also felt natural. One evening, after the kids were in bed, Michael and I sat on the back porch, sharing a quiet moment. The air was cool, the sound of crickets filling the silence between us. He leaned back in his chair, his expression weary but grateful. "I don't know what we'd do without you right now," he said, his voice soft. "You'd manage," I replied. "You always do." He shook his head. "Not like this. The kids adore you, Mindy. And so do I." The weight of his words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I wanted to brush it off, to keep things light, but the sincerity in his voice made it impossible. "It's been good for me too," I admitted. "Being here. Being part of their lives." For a moment, we sat in silence, the unspoken emotions between us louder than any words. Finally, he reached out and placed a hand over mine. "Thank you," he said simply. I nodded, my heart racing at the warmth of his touch. "Always." A week later, Naomi called with devastating news. Her mother had passed away, and though she planned to return soon, she needed time to grieve and settle her family's affairs. Her voice was heavy with exhaustion, and I could hear the weight of her loss in every word. "I don't know how to thank you, Mindy," she said. "For everything you've done for Michael and the kids. I don't know what we'd do without you." Her gratitude felt like both a balm and a burden. "You don't need to thank me," I said. "I'm just glad I can help." The weeks that followed were a blur of routines and quiet moments. Elijah and Sophia had begun to treat me like family, and their trust in me filled a void I hadn't realized was still there. Michael, too, seemed to rely on me more and more, our conversations growing deeper, our silences more comfortable. One evening, as I was tucking the kids into bed, Elijah looked up at me with sleepy eyes. "Are you going to stay forever, Aunt Mindy?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question caught me off guard. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly. "But I'll be here as long as you need me." "Good," he said, his eyes fluttering closed. "I like having you here." His words stayed with me as I closed the door and made my way downstairs. Michael was in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner, and I hesitated in the doorway, watching him for a moment. "They love you," he said without turning around. "You know that, right?" "They're incredible kids," I said, stepping into the room. "You've done such a good job with them." He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "It's not just me. Naomi, she brought us all together. She's the glue that holds this family together." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Naomi's absence was deeply felt, but so was the growing connection between me and the life she had built. It was a delicate balance, one I wasn't sure how to navigate. The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, as Michael and I were tidying up after dinner, the phone rang. It was Naomi's sister, calling to tell us that Naomi had been hospitalized with pneumonia. The stress of the past few months had taken a toll on her health, and though the doctors were optimistic, it was a stark reminder of how fragile life could be. Michael was visibly shaken, his usual composure crumbling under the weight of the news. I stepped in instinctively, taking charge of the kids and reassuring him that we would get through it together. The days that followed were some of the hardest I had faced in years. Michael and I leaned on each other in ways neither of us had anticipated, our shared worry for Naomi deepening the bond between us. I found myself taking on more and more, from coordinating the kids' activities to managing the household, all while keeping a brave face for Elijah and Sophia. One night, after the kids were asleep, Michael and I sat in the garage, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house. He was exhausted, his head in his hands, and I placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's strong," I said softly. "She'll get through this." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't have to," I replied, my heart pounding. Before I could think better of it, he leaned forward, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was equal parts hesitant and intense. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the weight of everything else falling away. But then the garage door creaked open, and we both turned to see Sophia standing there, her eyes wide with confusion. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.